Alright folks, let's dive into some of the darkest parts of our history. Picture this, living in a time where even the smallest slip-up could lead to horrific punishments like mutilation or public burnings. That was the brutal reality for millions of enslaved black people who were stripped of their dignity and treated like mere property. We take our freedoms for granted today, but back then, basic human rights were a distant dream for these folks. They endured unimaginable cruelties, with their bodies and spirits crushed. So let's face these harsh truths, remember the past, and honor those who went through such hellish times. Here are the 10 most brutal punishments inflicted upon enslaved black people during slavery. Before we get started, please make sure you like, subscribe, and share. 10. The collar. Black people have been perceived as less than human, categorized as cattle and subhuman. One of the instruments used to denote the 3/5 of a human was the iron collar. The iron collar was a harsh form of control used on enslaved black people. These collars made it difficult to move, sleep, or lie down comfortably. Iron collars varied in design. Some were simple bands of iron that encircled the neck, while others were more elaborate, featuring spikes or prongs that protruded inward or outward. These spikes would dig into the skin, causing pain with every movement. Some collars had chains attached, which could be used to tether the wearer to a post or other fixed object, further restricting their mobility. Beyond the physical pain, the iron collar had a significant psychological impact on enslaved individuals. The constant discomfort and inability to perform basic human functions without pain served as a daily reminder of their lack of freedom and autonomy. This physical torment was an integral part of the system of control exerted by slave owners. Numerous historical accounts document the use of iron collars. For instance, in the narratives of former enslaved individuals, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, there are descriptions of the brutal punishments endured, including the use of iron collars. These accounts provide a first-hand look at the cruelty inflicted upon the enslaved people. 9. Branding. If you go to any farm, owners who need to keep track of their cattle label their hides with symbols of the owner. This practice was also used on the enslaved as well. Branding involved burning the skin with a heated metal instrument to denote ownership. This was common during the era of black slavery, particularly in the South. Slaves were often branded with letters or symbols on their faces or shoulders to mark them as property and prevent escape. The practice left permanent scars and was a constant reminder of their subjugation. In Louisiana, the Code Noir even legalized branding as a punishment for runaway slaves, with New Orleans becoming one of the largest slave markets in America in the 19th century. In Virginia, slave owners burned their initials onto the cheeks or shoulders of their property as a deterrent. Reports from historical records suggest that masters would go so far as to brand the names of the entire slave-owning family on their slaves. These practices were widespread, to the point that old brands can still be found on the descendants of slaves in regions with historically high slave populations. Today, the scars of branding serve as tangible reminders of the inhumanity and cruelty of slavery. Historical records, narratives of formerly enslaved individuals, and artifacts preserved in museums document the practice and its impact on generations of people subjected to its brutality. Remembering the history of branding is crucial to acknowledging the resilience of those who endured slavery and understanding the lasting legacies of racial injustice and exploitation. 8. Whipping and salting. Continuing the theme as livestock, the enslaved were disciplined in the similar fashion animal keepers used to tame lions and other beasts. Whipping was a common punishment for enslaved individuals, often leaving severe scars. In some cases, owners would aggravate the pain by applying substances like red pepper, turpentine, or salt to the wounds. These acts of cruelty caused immense physical pain and long-lasting trauma. In America, slaves, including pregnant women and children, were often whipped as punishment. Not only were slaves violently whipped, but sometimes the wounds would be rubbed with salt brine. Ever heard the phrase, throwing salt in the wound, to describe a bad situation made worse? This practice of whipping and salting of wounds, along with other torturous methods like turpentine and hot pepper juice, was sadly common among enslaved individuals, punished for various reasons deemed appropriate by their overseers or owners. Unfortunately, some slaves even got whipped when they did nothing wrong. To their masters, in order to prevent any potential defiance, slave owners may sometimes whip their slaves even before any offense was even committed. This was seen as a way to break their spirit and prevent future transgressions. 7. Pitch capping. The practice of tying and burning slaves over hot grease, also known as pitch capping or similar terms, was a particularly gruesome form of punishment inflicted on enslaved individuals during the era of slavery. The process typically involved tying the enslaved person securely with ropes or chains and suspending them over a fire or heated grease. Sometimes, a pot containing boiling fat or grease was placed underneath the suspended individual, causing drops of scalding liquid to fall on their exposed skin. This method ensured prolonged agony and was intended not only to physically harm, but also instill fear among other enslaved individuals witnessing the punishment. Harriet Jacobs, an escaped slave, recounted the brutal punishments she witnessed. One such method involved suspending a slave over a fire with a piece of fat pork above. As the pork cooked, scalding drops of fat fell on the slave's bare skin, causing continuous pain. Pitch capping was employed predominantly in the American South, where harsh plantation conditions and the brutal enforcement of labor often led to extreme measures of punishment to maintain order and deter resistance. 6. Mutilation. The battering of the black body has historically been a popular method of punishment inflicted by Western institutions. Mutilation was one of the most common forms of extreme punishment. Enslaved individuals could have their teeth broken, fingers clamped in vices, or limbs cut off as punishment. These acts were meant to instill fear and assert control. During the Middle Passage, ship captains would resort to extreme measures of this version of brutality, especially for the recaptured slaves. Those who attempted to escape were used as gruesome warnings to others. And in the harsh conditions of sugar plantations, slaves who succumbed to exhaustion and fell asleep in the mill might have a limb cut off as an example to other slaves of the dangers of falling asleep on the job. 5. Hog's head. According to an account from a former slave who suffered and witnessed many forms of cruel punishments while enslaved, another form was considered a sadistic game. The practice of hog's head was a punishment that involved placing enslaved individuals inside large barrels with nails hammered into them, leaving the sharp ends protruding inward. The victims were then rolled down hills or slopes, causing the nails to tear into their flesh as the barrel moved. This form of punishment was particularly sadistic and was intended to inflict maximum pain and suffering. Accounts of hoghead punishment are documented in narratives and testimonies from formerly enslaved individuals. Moses Roper, in his narrative published in the mid-19th century, described witnessing such punishments being inflicted on enslaved people by their masters. These first-hand recollections provide visceral details of the horrors endured by enslaved individuals subjected to such torturous practices. In some cases, slaveholders derived sadistic pleasure from inflicting physical and psychological torment on their enslaved laborers. The brutality of hogshead punishment exemplifies the extreme violence inherent in the institution of slavery. 4. The Virginia Plague. According to an escaped slave from Virginia, a certain form of punishment he encountered was considered a cruel game, forcing the victims to come within inches of their last breath. A punishment called the Virginia Plague, where slaves were tied and whipped in a smokehouse, then subjected to suffocating smoke from the burning tobacco stems. This method was used to inflict maximum pain and fear. Enslaved individuals would be subjected to severe whippings or beatings, often in a public or semi-public setting. These punishments were intended not only to inflict physical pain, but also to serve as a spectacle of power and dominance by the slaveholder. After being beaten, the enslaved person would be tied up and confined in a smokehouse. Tobacco stems or other materials would be ignited to produce smoke, which would fill the small enclosed space. This act of suffocation and exposure to smoke was meant to further degrade and punish the individual. Descriptions of the Virginia Plague can be found in narratives and accounts from formerly enslaved individuals, abolitionist literature, and historical records. These testimonies provide vivid and harrowing details of the brutalities endured by enslaved people under the institution of slavery. 3. Picketing. Picketing and spraddling were cruel methods of restraint and punishment used against enslaved individuals during the era of slavery in the United States. Picketing involved tying a slave's arms above their head to a tree branch or other elevated structure. This forced the enslaved person to stand on their toes for extended periods, often in uncomfortable or precarious positions. The purpose of picketing was twofold: to physically exhaust and punish the enslaved person, and to act as a public display of power and control by the slaveholder. The physical strain of picketing could lead to severe pain and long-lasting physical damage, including muscle cramps, joint problems, and even permanent disabilities. Spraddling, also known as whipping, targeted pregnant slaves, requiring them to lay face down on a shallow hole while being lashed across their back. This act not only caused immediate pain, but also led to complications during pregnancy. The severity of the whipping varied, but often resulted in deep lacerations, severe pain, and sometimes permanent physical damage. Spraddling was used as a punitive measure for perceived infractions or acts of resistance, as well as means of asserting control and discipline over enslaved populations. 2. Punishment cells. Slaves who attempted to escape or refused to work were often confined in small, airless spaces called torture chambers or punishment cells. Torture chambers were small, often windowless rooms or cells designed to inflict severe physical and psychological suffering on enslaved individuals. These spaces were intentionally constructed to maximize discomfort and isolation, depriving the enslaved of basic necessities such as light, ventilation, and sometimes even food and water. Additionally, slave owners would sometimes line the walls with spikes to prevent slaves from leaning or resting. The emotional torment inflicted by these chambers was equally damaging, as the victims were left to contemplate their fate in isolation, knowing that escape was impossible. Enslaved individuals could be confined in torture chambers for various reasons, including attempted escape, acts of disobedience, or perceived threats to the authority of slaveholders. The duration of confinement varied, ranging from hours to days or even weeks, depending on the severity of the perceived offense and the whims of the slaveholder. The psychological toll of being confined in a torture chamber was profound. Isolation, sensory deprivation, and the constant fear of further punishment contributed to feelings of despair, helplessness, and psychological trauma. Many enslaved individuals confined in these spaces experienced acute anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of their confinement. 1. Public burning. Throughout history, punishments inflicted on slaves were often public spectacles intended to instill fear and obedience in other enslaved individuals. These gruesome displays were even attended by neighboring townspeople as a form of entertainment. Among the most horrifying methods of punishment was public burning, where victims were either tied to a stake or hung above a fire. Some died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them, while others suffered unimaginable burning agony until death finally provided release. One such instance is the tale of a slave named Jerry. In 1830, Jerry was burned in an open field with thousands of spectators. The scene included a large pile of pitch pine logs and kindling where he was chained to a stake. Despite the inhumane circumstances, Jerry reportedly prayed audibly as the flames consumed him, and his execution became notorious as the last recorded instance of burning a slave in South Carolina. Why did he receive such a punishment, you may wonder? Well, Jerry was charged with the abuse of the wife of his subcontracted master, a heavy sin indeed. While such an act is inexcusable, we also cannot excuse the fact that if a white man had done the same, he would have received a lighter punishment. And in cases where they abused enslaved women, there might not have even been a trial at all. Jerry's case, while legally sanctioned, is proof of the unequal application of justice at the time, where a black man faced the ultimate punishment for a crime that a white man would have received a lesser sentence for. These 10 examples barely scratch the surface of the unimaginable suffering endured by enslaved black people in America, the cruelty inflicted upon them, of the inhumanity that can arise when power is abused. By learning about these atrocities, we honor the memory of those who suffered and ensure that their stories are not forgotten.